All right, we're going to start the next chapter of Life Against Death, and this one's called Neurosis and History. So, in the last chapter, we were dealing with repression and the disease called man. I mean, I don't even know what's the problem with this thing. So, here it is: the Neurosis and History. The doctrine that all men are mad appears to conflict with a historical perspective on the nature and destiny of man. It appears to swallow all cultural variety, all historical change, into a darkness in which all cats are gray. But this objection neglects the richness and complexity of the Freudian theory of neurosis. Of somehow neurosis is tied into the act of memory. And so let's go a little. What do we got over here? Right here we have something of the dynamics. This part right here. Um, It is a Freudian theorem that each individual neurosis is not static but dynamic. It is a historical process with its own internal logic. There is something that is making the memory more available. So in the individual, each of us has our own available memory. We're not sure why one memory is more available to another. We could say it's about intensity, but how do we how do how is one memory more intense to another? Does it have to require trauma? The trauma of pain, the trauma of pleasure. Pleasure abducts you out of your contentment. And so this neurosis is another word for personality, the thing that comes before the memory that actually possesses the memory. A neurosis is the veil or the lens in which reality appears to us. And then there's a greater memory called history, and it's put in books. It's written by academics and historians, and they create this bigger platform called history. Um, because of the basic unsatisfactory nature of the neurotic compromise, tension between the repressed and the repressing factors persists and produces a constant series of new symptom formations. And the series of symptom formations is not a shapeless series of mere changes. It exhibits a regressive pattern, which Freud calls the slow return of the repressed. The slow return of the repressed. So we're here over here at the top of this page, up here. It is a law of neurotic disease, he says, that these obsessive acts increasingly come closer to the original impulse and to the original forbidden act itself, the doctrine of the universal neurosis of mankind. If we take it seriously, therefore, it compels us to entertain the hypothesis that the pattern of history exhibits a dialectic not hitherto recognized by historians, the dialectic of neurosis. So in here, Norman Brown's actually trying to go back as far as we can into the recording of history, the symptom of recorded history, the symptom of memory. Over here at the end of this chapter, this paragraph, I mean, the link between the theory of neurosis and the theory of history is the theory of religion, as is made perfectly clear in Totem and Taboo and the Moses and Monotheism. And the link affects both ends. Link. Freud not only maintained that human history can be understood only as a neurosis, but also that the neurosis of the individuals can be understood only in the context of human history as a whole. Freud says in Moses and Monotheism, I have never doubted that religious phenomena are to be understood only on the model of the neurotic symptoms of the individual. Accordingly to the analogy elaborated in Moses' Monotheism, in the history of the species, something happens similar to the events in the life of the individual. That is to say, mankind as a whole passed through conflicts of sexual aggressive nature, which left permanent traces, but which were for the most part warded off and forgotten. Later, after a long period of latency, they came to life again and created phenomena similar in structure and tendency as to the neurotic symptom. I'm going to conclude that the chapters Neurosis and History, we're dealing with how memory is recorded. In a macrocosmic way, memory is recorded in the term history, and in a smaller microcosmic way, it is the individual's memory. And so if we go to the end of this chapter, and right here, we should Norman's trying to figure out that what is it that we're viewing before we judge it. There's a prior neurosis that allows us to judge. And so it is in this last paragraph on page 19. By the same token, psychoanalysis offers a theoretical framework for exploring the possibility of a way out of the nightmare of endless progress and endless Faustian discontent, a way out of the human neurosis, a way out of history. In the case of the neurotic individual, the goal of psychoanalytical therapy is to free him from the burden of his past, to be free from the burden of the past, from the burden of his history, the burden which compels him to go on having and being a case history. We are nothing but our history. But what is that? When we think about this, the history is a product created from our neurosis. And when we use the term neurosis, we can actually say that it is manufactured. We create our history. It doesn't just pre-exist. We have an ability of evaluating history and using it in our presence. But that is our neurosis. And there's this thing, can we actually free ourselves from our history? This case history? And the method of psychoanalytical therapy is to deepen the historical consciousness of the individual, fill up the memory gaps, becoming aware that we don't record everything. We take certain parts and we call that our experience. But there's gaps in our memory. So till he awakens from his own history as from a nightmare, it's in those gaps that there is creativity. So in the artistic process of the poet, we have a history that we can recall upon that creates our neurotic personality, or just our who we are. But yet there's holes in that memory. There's an ability to recreate that memory, that neurosis, create a new neurosis. Psychoanalytical consciousness as a higher stage in the general consciousness of mankind may be likewise the fulfillment of the historical consciousness, that ever-widening and deepening search for origins which has obsessed Western thought ever since the Renaissance. If historical consciousness is finally transformed into psychoanalytical consciousness, the grip of the dead hand of the past on life in the present would be loosened, and man would be ready to live instead of making history, to enjoy instead of paying back old scores and debts, and to enter that state of being which was the goal of his becoming. I'm going to read that last part again. If historical consciousness is finally transformed into psychoanalytic consciousness, the grip of the dead hand of the past on life in the present would be loosened, and mankind would be ready to live instead of making history, to enjoy instead of paying back old scores and debts, and to enter the state of being which was the goal of his becoming. That last paragraph I have a problem with is I just, can you live without a relic? Isn't there something sacred in memory? Isn't there something superficial in being a hedonist and disregarding everything that came before you? Should one just give up on originality and just seek pleasure, even though you've seen it happen a million times? The sexual act of in and out, the humping, the build up of tension, the release. Can 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 one reconcile the sacred, the great artistic adventures of history? Isn't art created out of a neurosis, out of an obsession with the past, possession of the past? So in this last Neurosis and History, Norman O'Brien is just trying to bring attention to exactly how history isn't singular. It isn't written as law. It's actually written as symptom. So all laws are symptoms. All history is neurotic. So this is important to frame that, because the poet can exist in that zone of creation. When you make things into laws, they cease to allow invention. But what we're wrestling with is that there has to be a law to interpret. Although he does like to pursue this freedom from history, if he saw the world today, it's shallow, it's throwaway, it's junk, it's cheap, it doesn't last, and that a true neurosis needs to last. That's the key to art, is probably to plague the world with your new neurosis. A poet re-evaluates a new neurosis in his own investigation, and then he formulates it into a church as he becomes more and more of a priest. So, once again, all memory is a symptom. A law is a symptom, and the creation of a new law would be called a new neurosis. And all history is a neurosis. And so a poet is one that looks into the past and is able to free himself from the past so that he can use its pieces in a freer, more improvisational way. And I think that's all we're really trying to do in these first 20 pages. All I think I've come away with is that we need to treat the world more as a thrift store in which we can go down any aisle we want and view these objects of history and reposition them any way we want as artists. So we're allowed to go wherever we want, take pieces however we want to take pieces. There is no genre. There is no right way to do anything. we're just learning a new way of taking on images, words, pieces to reassemble them into something new, to birth something new, a new language, a new medium that's different than a movie, that's different than a music, a song. I mean, think how we name these things: songs, commercial, photograph, painting. They seem so they've been here forever, but there could be a new way of a new object available to us to create a new framework for art, the art process. And the poet is the singular investigator. And then as he gets his tools together, he assembles his library. He finds his own rituals. He shares them with the world. He then becomes the priest, and the church is raised. So that's just Neurosis and History, the second chapter of part one, the problem. And then what we have next after that is, I think we go into the solution. Let me see what he says here. Part two, Eros. Freud's Eros is that energy of, we don't know where it comes from, the desire to create, to love, to be attracted to something. So I'm going to read that. Freud's two instincts, Eros and death, are fundamental by hypotheses as to the general character of the repressed forces inherent in human nature by virtue of its connection with a body. Though repressed and unrecognized, these are energies which create human culture. And to recognize their existence is to reinterpret human culture. Human culture is then reconnected with the human body. Eros creates culture, and Eros is the bodily sexual instinct. So now we're gonna, in these next chapters, we're gonna move into part two, and there's certain terms that will come up again and again. The priest body, the church body, the poet body, and then the things in between the bodies is memory. The memory is the invisible energy between bodies. So bodies would be locations of these potential universes, potential poets, potential priests, potential churches. And then what's between us is the access to memories and the reassemblage of memories. So that's the end of that. Next section is going to be chapter 3, part 2, Eros, section 3, sexuality and childhood. So that's something I'll get into tomorrow. I'll see you guys later.